You guys ready?
Yeah.
Good afternoon. I'm here with Ben Nessenbaum from my office. I'm Attorney John Burris. And we're here after having filed a civil rights lawsuit last night, if you will, on behalf of the Quinto family, the mother and sister. And the basis of it is that we believe that Angelo Quinto was wrongfully killed by the police in the manner in which they employed in our view, an illegal restraint called restraint asphyxia. Restraint asphyxiation is what happened here. And it is a real tragedy for us and for the family, because this did not have to happen. In our view, that if the officers had exercised just the modicum of de-escalation, they could have had a conversation, they could have communicated, they could have reassessed the situation. But no, they did not do that. They immediately threw him to the floor, even though he was being held in a cuddly way with by his mom, and threw him to the floor. And then, inexplicably, they handcuffed him, put his knees behind his back, pulled him up, pushed him down, and then put a knee, a la George Floyd, on the back of his neck. Angelo, at best, yelled out early, but after a minute or so, he was unresponsive, and the officers didn't even appreciate what was happening, because they, in fact, switched places. The officer who initially had his knee on Angelo's back became tired, he says. He then switched places with the other officer, and that officer then returned and he put his knee in the back of Angelo's neck. But neither one of them even gave any acknowledgement that he was unresponsive and was not, in fact, at all acting in a dilatory, negative way. The disturbing component of this, we all know and have said that before Angelo was taken down, that he had told the officers, shouted at least twice, "Please don't kill me." And that's a big deal for us, because it reminds us of the George Floyd case, in a sense that he too was begging not to be killed, based upon some sense of what police do and have done in prior occasions to other people. But he made that statement twice. And an officer responded, "Don't worry, we're not going to kill you." But in fact, they did. And he was on the floor, them on top of him, for at least 5 to 8 minutes. And during that period of time, he was essentially unresponsive. There is no situation that we have seen that would indicate that that kind of force should have been used. This is a call where the sister had said that she was concerned. Angelo was acting paranoid. He had been wanting to stay close to his mom and sister, did not want to be left alone. Clearly, he was in a mental health crisis. He had had one several months before. The police had been with him there before. That should have alerted them that a previous relationship had occurred and that there was a mental health problem here. So then raises the whole question about how do you respond? And did you respond appropriately when you had some knowledge and reason to believe that he was mentally impaired? Because any reasonable police officer should have noted when Angelo is being held in a bear hug in a cuddly way by his mother on the floor, and that something was amiss in terms of him. There had been no physical force. And so the conduct by the officers, in our view, violated Angelo's civil rights, which is the Fourth Amendment, use of excessive force, which is extraordinarily important. The 14th Amendment, which goes to the loss of the familiar relationship, that is, that the mother lost her relationship with him, which would have been for another 35, 40 years perhaps. So that's a huge, huge loss. And then we have state court cause of action, where we have a wrongful death, which is an intentional act. Obviously, it could be negligent or intentional, but in any event, it's a state cause of action that's important. And equally important is another cause of action called negligent infliction of emotional distress. And that is that these acts, these dastardly acts committed by the police in the presence of his mom and his sisters, violated their state court rights, and therefore they have the right to have petition as part of this case as well. And we also have another cause of action called Monell. That's a pattern and practice cause of action. And the reason why we have that is because one of the officers had a history that we were able to identify so far of using excessive force. We also have a concern that this is a ratification and deliberate indifference toward what had taken place. And we say that because the chief's statements that were made shortly thereafter just clearly were not true. And they obviously had the impact of trying to protect the officers. But first they said that Angelo was under the influence of methamphetamines, which was not true. The medical, at the very first, at the outset when the blood was taken, he was not under the influence of any drugs at all. And then secondly, there was this question, they claimed that he was combative. That's why they had to use force. Well, the evidence by the mom and the sisters clear that that did not happen. That at best he was being held and cuddled, and they're the officers the one that used the force that was there. And then the next thing, the officers, and the reason why this was important is because it was an attempt to shame the victim. This is a young man who's dead. It happened in front of his mother and sister, but yet the effort was to shame him, to suggest that he caused his own demise. And that to me was outrageous and despicable, because the facts are pretty clear. There was a mental case and should have been treated as such. And so then it suggested he had a medical condition, which the officer, the chief said at some point. When the evidence is pretty clear, there was no medical condition. This was a healthy young man, 30 years old, former in the Navy, Navy vet, was at home, was starting to experience some paranoia, but he was physically healthy. And I think, and to suggest that he had a medical problem, and should have said it was a mental problem, because they knew that if it was a mental problem, he should have been treated differently. You should not have this failure to de-escalate this situation. All you really had to do, you see the mom holding on to her son on the floor, almost like in a cuddling baby bear situation, or even a child, like, to see that there's some, and in fact, they did acknowledge something, because they said some comment, an officer did, oh, mom is strong, and as if, because she was actually holding on to him, but yet they yanked him away, and there was no de-escalation efforts at all, which is very, very troubling, because all they had to do was have a brief conversation with him, to initiate some conversation with him, but they never did that. And at best, what happened is that he was snatched, thrown on the floor. Within 3 or 4 minutes, his life was snuffed out of him like he was something, an animal of some kind. So we've tried that. There's a lot more activities that were taken here in this case. It had a lot of positiveness that's come out of it. I think the City of Antioch, in terms of the political people, have responded well. We'll talk about that later. We know that there's some state activities taking place, legislation. So the case has had some benefit in that sense, in terms of moving the social agenda as it relates toward how to deal with mentally impaired people. But aside from that, we're concerned about the liability here, that a young person's life was taken unlawfully and unjustifiably, and there has to be a price to pay for that. And that's why we're here. We should not be here. Now, I bring Ben on. Ben Soldier is working on the case, and he will talk.
Thank you. So we've received the paramedic records and the medical records from when Mr. Quinto was in the hospital, and they shed a lot of light on what happened. So we've also conducted a second autopsy, and so we know pretty much what happened and how Mr. Quinto died. And we also know that the police, in this case, began to fabricate and lie about what happened pretty quickly afterwards. But here's the timeline. So the officers arrived, and they restrained Mr. Quinto in a prone restraint for about 6.5 minutes. Now, we have a recording that would suggest that he wasn't making any sound for about 5 of those minutes. So, and yet they're still restraining him in a prone position. Mr. Quinto suffered injuries. Now, you all may have heard the chief's press conference that he held. And I got to tell you, we have sued the chief because that is a straight cover-up. It's a cover-up because he said there were no injuries consistent with asphyxiation. Well, petechial hemorrhages in the eyes are a prime indicator of asphyxiation, and those are present. So that's there. Now the question, okay, how do those get there? Well, that happens when you have a prone restraint. We know that Mr. Quinto suffered other injuries, facial injuries, that are consistent with his head being held down, face down. And the chief would suggest that there was no significant force used against Mr. Quinto. And yet, the officers, the first thing they tell paramedics when they arrive, at some point, they tell paramedics that Mr. Quinto became combative with them, so they had to restrain him. Now, it's strange because you didn't hear that from the chief, and yet that's what they told the paramedics. Then they also told the paramedics that he was high on methamphetamine. Where does that come from? We know the tox screen is negative. No methamphetamine, no amphetamine. So these are all fabrications. Now so the paramedics arrive, allegedly, according to the report, they arrive, and Mr. Quinto's apneic and pulseless. That basically means that he is dead at that point. No heartbeat, no breathing. So they arrive, and they begin CPR right away. And they note they don't know how long he has been that way. That means it didn't just happen when they arrived, it had happened before their arrival. Then the officers call in to dispatch, but they take several minutes to do that they have a subject whose CPR is beginning. That takes them about 3 minutes to do that, to make that call. You would think that call would happen right away. But we believe that they were starting to try to discuss and get a story straight at that point in time. Then we have this from the medical records. A Detective Bledsoe, actually tells the doctors, don't talk to the family. Don't return their calls. Don't talk to the family. Now, the family, of course, as you know, is desperate to get information. How's my son? How's he doing? How's Angelo doing? And the police are telling the doctors, don't communicate to the family? And what are the police doing at that time? They're telling the family that Angelo's okay. He wasn't okay. He was essentially dead, at the scene. While the paramedics and CPR was able to get a heartbeat back, the brain damage had been done already. And that's clear on the medical records too, if you follow them. And I put all of this in the complaint so it can be tracked. And then what do we have? The police, they don't announce this death. They don't treat it as a death in custody. And by the way, was it a mental health situation? The police said that they called the paramedics for a 5150. That's a mental health situation. So if it's a 5150, they say that's why they called the paramedics. It's kind of odd, but in any event, we think they called the paramedics because they realized much sooner than they let on that Angelo had stopped breathing. And they were just trying to cover it. And it's been that way ever since. So now we have a coroner's inquest that we've heard will be happening soon. We just heard that. And we'll see what they have to say, but the family has retained a coroner. This was a death by restraint asphyxia. There are no drugs in the system. Now, you've also heard the chief say that, well, they couldn't find any drugs in the system, so now they're expanding the testing. I mean, it's kind of like, it's like OJ out there looking for the real killer, right? I mean, we know how Angelo died. He died at the hands of these officers. They're responsible. Everything since then from the police has been trying to cover up and trying to somehow put the shade and the blame on Angelo and his family. The chief would have even suggested that the injuries that Angelo had might have come from his mom, as opposed to the officers restraining him. I don't think so.
One thing I want to be clear about, Angelo was perfectly healthy when he was being held by his mom. When 6 to 8 minutes, he becomes brain dead. And that's a function of oxygen not getting to the brain. It doesn't take forever in a day for that to happen. So it's pretty hard, and that can only happen when your airways, your diaphragm, and your airways are suppressed, and it limits the amount of oxygen. The police are the only group that had possession of him. They had his body, they had control of his legs, they were pushing down on his backside and on his neck, all of which contributes to a lack of oxygen based upon the restraints that were being imposed upon him. So there's no dispute that logically, when they were in certain places, that the police are in fact the culprits here. They caused this. And all this efforts after that designed to try to push the blame away and somehow push it onto Angelo that he caused his own death, or push it onto his mom that she somehow caused his death. But if you think about what really happened, it was a lack of oxygen to the brain. TPI is an example of that. And the brain dead is a function of not getting oxygen. And it was only the police that were in a position to do that kind of activity, engage in that type of conduct. And that's the tragedy of this whole thing. This particular restraint, asphyxiation, that restraint process that was employed should be outlawed, and it should not be used in any department. And you certainly should not put your neck, your knee, or your foot on the back of someone's neck. These are things that we will look at and try to work our way through, because obviously those are very limiting factors. And in fact, when the mom said at one point, "Why are you doing this?" That is with the knee on the back of the neck, and the officer said, "This is how we do things to get control." Well, that was not a very satisfactory answer when she could see that her son was dying in front of her. That couldn't be what you're supposed to do as a way. So those are the facts that we have, and that's the reason why we filed this particular lawsuit. Now, what I'll do now, before I take any questions, I will call on Robert, stepfather, and sister, and the mom, all of you.
Sorry, guys.
Robert, you talk.
Oh, now
In
it's
fact, now you got to do. Hi.
Sorry, guys. I'll do it.
Thank you.
It's so heavy right now. It's just taking a lot of.
It's a big taller than me.
It's a little heavy today.
Thank you. So I'm Robert Collins. I'm Angelo's stepdad. He called me dad. When this happens to your family, it's an incredible loss, and there's no way to bring Angelo back, and we know that. But we want justice and we want change to come out of this, because what you can get is maybe making it a little bit better, and better for the next person that has to face this situation. Angelo had a mental health crisis, and he was very unjustly killed for that crisis. And we need to change systems, and we need to change the way that we respond to mental health issues in our society, so that no one else loses their life as a result of doing nothing wrong. He didn't do anything wrong. He was suffering from a medical condition due to an injury that he had. He threatened nobody, he used no violence, and he ended up dead and asphyxiated. So I just wanted to share with you some of the good things that are coming out of this. And again, we can't bring Angelo back, but what we have been successful in doing is helping other council members and Mayor Thorpe in Antioch here in bringing about some much needed reforms. It's amazing. When we were talking about this 6 months ago, it was still controversial to have body cams and dash cams. And now all of a sudden, everyone thinks they make perfect sense because they bring accountability. And I think they do make perfect sense. They bring accountability. It's amazing that Antioch was one of the last communities to impose this. Why did they fight for 10 years not to have them when it increases accountability? So at least we're all on the same page now, and we all agree, and it was passed unanimously. But that's a victory for everyone, I think. If we can work on policies that make sense, the body camps will bring accountability to Antioch, and that is something the City Council has passed, and now they're actually in use. The City of Antioch is also moving forward, and we want to thank the council members for their work on this. We're trying to help them in any way we can to push forward mental health response teams that are culturally competent and that don't involve the police. That is what Angelo needed that night. We would have a very different outcome if that had been available, we believe. On the state level, we have been working with Assemblymember Mike Gibson on AB 490, which is a bill that has passed the Assembly and is at the Senate now. It's passed the Public Safety Committee at the Assembly. with a very good majority, and so we're hoping for passage in the full Senate. AB 490 prevents holds that lead to positional asphyxia. And as we know, 6 months ago we were saying we hope that Angelo will be the last. That was our hope back then, but he's not been the last. There's been many other people in the Bay Area killed through positional asphyxia, so it's not uncommon. So we're working with that and urge all of you to support that. And we'll keep on working with more reforms for the City of Antioch and hoping that that we can bring some sanity to the system. I don't think it's it becomes politicized. It really shouldn't be politicized. We all need a working police system that we can trust and that we know, and trust comes from accountability and transparency, not through trusting a specific person to run a good police department, but actually through systems where we can check. So it's good to trust your police department, but you can't trust your police department if you don't have systems of accountability built in. Just a word, you don't want to trust any human being with a simple word. So I want to share with you that because it does mean that to us it brings some closure and some meaning to what is otherwise a senseless death. And I think particularly in this case, Angelo was not violent. He had never been violent his entire life. He didn't have a violent bone in him. If you see his videos of him dancing around with his tita, he was a very loving guy. He had his problems like all of us, but they were not violence related and they were not harming anyone else. So thank you. And we're hoping that the lawsuit will also be a tool to bring about further change.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dad.
You guys want me to lower it again, or you good?
Oh, is this good? Hello. I'm Bella Orbea Quinto Collins. I'm Angelo's sister, younger sister. He was 12. Oh, and this is my mom, Cassandra Quinto Collins. Yeah, Angelo's mom. My brother was 12 and a half years older than me, but we shared a ridiculous anxiety over dying too soon. And I hope to live a very long life, but not like this. I saw my brother dead 3 times in person, and if you count how many times I saw him dead on camera, that's much more than that. My mom, on December 25th, brought a card to the hospital to read him some notes from my family members, and I didn't bother signing it because he was not in a position wherein his mind was even capable of accepting that. He was, for all intents and purposes, brain dead. And every day of our lives we live with guilt, no matter how much anyone tries to help us out and improve our mental state and tell us that we did the right thing. We did everything that we possibly could, and it was such a difficult situation. But we're gonna have to live with that for a long time. And that's just a part of the lack of closure that we're going to experience. That's just a fact, especially of these kinds of incidents. And like my dad was talking about, there are things that we can do that better us and better our communities in small ways, and things that we will continue to work toward for the foreseeable future and after that. Like working with NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, the Contra Costa NAMI division, and advocating for legislation like AB 988 that, like my father said, just requests a non-police response to mental health emergencies. And that's another crazy thing to me. It's just the fact that on December 23rd, or maybe it was the 24th, it was 11:12 p.m., right? They acknowledged this mental health crisis, and there was no one else that could help us. But anyway, I think that might have been a slight digression, so I'm sorry. But Yes, and then some more legislation like AB 490, the Angelo Quinto Act of 2021. Because death is permanent. It's the most permanent thing I've ever known. And we're never, ever gonna get his smile back, or he's never gonna irritate me again. I miss that a lot. I wanted to see him old. I didn't expect to go to his funeral at 18. Sorry. He didn't deserve what happened to him, and nobody deserves that. It hurts to remember him, and sorry. It hurts to remember how he went. But he believed that he had a guardian angel. And if there is something more for him, I hope that he has it. Sorry. But yes, we'll continue to try and just diminish the possibility of people dying in this way, or even just being impacted in this way. It's something, death is permanent, but so is our pain. So yes. Sorry.
So let me, before I take questions here, from the Contra Costa, you want to come up here? But I want to just say this. The crisis and the situation we have here, the reason why it's so significant is that Ben and I and my office have been involved in many mental health cases down through the years. And in those cases, most of all of them were such that a little reassessment, a little de-escalation, reconsideration of where you are and who was involved really could have saved a person's life. Many of you know this data, with the Washington Post and the Guardian, and now the FBI is starting to accumulate this data. There's generally 1,000 to 1,200 shooting deaths of police every year. That's statistical data, and I've been watching this data now myself for over 5 years. And of those, 25% or more are mentally impaired people. Some of those people could have been saved if there had been an approach that was different from a felony approach to it. Now, there are efforts being made around the country. You know, certainly many of you are aware of the Memphis Plan, many of you are aware of the CIT programs in many cities, and they can be effective if you follow them. Because if you follow them, you will de-escalate the situation and you will assess what can be done to save the person's life as opposed to getting that person under control. This is a situation where it was more effort designed to control him as opposed to finding out how to help him and to help the family. That's a wrong-headed approach. And I think that some effort is being made around the country to change this approach, and even in California and in other cities. And I think that we can move forward and should move forward with that effort. In this case, certainly is one that's at the top of the list from our point of view to make change happen. My family certainly suggests that. But Gigi, let me talk to you.
I just wanted to quickly say this one definitely did need to happen, because at the latter part of November, I went and did a training at Antioch Police Department. After Miles Hall was killed in June of 2009, we at NAMI came up with a brochure, and we said, whenever you go out, 2019, sorry. I said, whenever you go out, leave this brochures with the family so they have more information about the supports that they have in place. So for me to have just gone out to the Antioch Police Department and them not to make contact with the family so that they could have gave them appropriate resources where they would have better understood. And my position is, use the police as a last resort. Do not use them if you can get a mental health crisis response team. So in this county, they're lifting up a project in which they're going to be naming the program after Miles Hall, but it's too late for Angelo, it's too late for Tyrell Wilson, and we really truly want it to be a anyone, any place, anytime program in this county, because the funding is there for it. I'm not sure the compassion is there for it for communities of color. And that's a big issue, because if you look at the statistically, in this county, the individuals who have been killed by law enforcement have all been men of color, and that's not acceptable. So we're pleased to have a relationship with the Quinto family and with the Hall family, so we can make a difference at NAMI, because mental illness is affecting 1 in 4 families, and we can do a much better job, and the police have a responsibility to treat mental illness as what it is, a medical condition. And therefore, this, in my opinion, was a cold-blooded murder. Sorry, that's how I see this. Gigi Crowder.
The other thing is part of what Gigi is saying is that, and I think we mentioned it earlier, that Antioch had noticed that this person may be mentally impaired, because there was the issue a month before where he got disoriented in his house here, and the police came, and because of how he was taken in the 5150, which is a legal term for a person not capable of taking care of themselves, and he was held. And so it came from this house. And so then later, the night of this event, they were aware also that he was acting paranoid. He was told that. And even they, in their own issue, sending for paramedics with the notion it was 5150. So that in and of itself gives you the fact that there was notice, and there should have been some effort to not treat this as a felony detainment of a person who committed a bad crime, but a person who was in need of help. And that's why the police were called. And so hopefully we will move to a situation where help will be called not from the local police agency, but from more of a community-based sociological, psychological framework, because I think we can save some lives. Unfortunately, I think that there's efforts being made along those lines, but it certainly could have been done here, and it wasn't. And so we have a dead young man that should not be dead, and that's hurtful to all of us, especially. Okay, I'll take any questions. Sorry, Robert.
I just forgot to mention a couple of people that have been really instrumental in making changes in Antioch, and I just want to get the opportunity to do that. So I just want to thank Mayor Lamar Thorpe, who's been very instrumental in making changes in Antioch and reforming things in Antioch, Vice Mayor Monica Wilson, and our own council member right here in this district, Council Member Tamisha
Torres-Walker.
Torres-Walker, my goodness, in front of the camera, I sort of forget things that I would know a second ago. So Tamisha Torres-Walker has been very instrumental and leads the subcommittee or the committee on police reform. So I just want to take the opportunity to thank them for all the efforts in Antioch to bring about sensible reform. Thank you.
Okay.
I just raised that up again real quick. It's just,
May not be any questions.
I got something.
The second autopsy has not been made public. We don't have a written report. We have the statements from the pathologist or the medical examiner advising us as to what it is. We expect that will come shortly, but we have not received it as of yet. But we did have the blood. We had a lot of materials. So some of the slides that they take in autopsy, we had those, and whatever else he needed in order to make that decision.
Blood testing, the same blood that was taken from Mr. Quinto, that's been tested. He's tested that.
So, in ways that they should have.
Can you clarify the lawsuit? You said you were filing against the chief of police himself and the department?
Oh, yeah, of course. Just so you know, we filed a lawsuit against the City of Antioch, of course, and that's the entity, and the police officers, the chief, and the individual officers that were involved. Okay? And so there's 4 to 6 officers that were involved. Okay.
Is there any criminal charges?
Pardon me?
Criminal charges against the
Well,
officers?
obviously, we're not in a position to make criminal charges, but I do know the DA has the case, and they've been investigating it, and we'll see how they come out of it. We're involved in several other cases. They've prosecuted one case after 2 years, and we have another case with that same officer. That's in about the same time this case is. And so these are cases that I think under present-day environment should be reviewed, particularly in light of the fact that the criminal law statute has changed. And so it once was reasonable conduct. Now it's a question of reasonable and necessary. What is necessary to do when in fact it was done. Now that gets you from, it seems to me, the movement away from murder to manslaughter in these cases. And I think that's another critical important. That doesn't really trouble me, but I think it's important to have criminal charges filed. If it was, you may think of, but it was unnecessary, because unnecessary means you had alternatives, and you failed to exercise any judgment about what the alternatives were. And if you exercise judgment about alternatives, you would not have had to kill this person. And so that's an important factor for us to be considered, and one that we consider.
And watching the video, when the officers came in, and I used to work for county mental health, when you come in as an officer, you look at the patient, you do an assessment. I didn't see them do that.
Well,
What I saw them do is basically snatch Angelo out of his mother's arms and to the floor. So how are you equipped to do a medical assessment? How are you equipped to be able to assess a 5150 when you didn't even go in and assess him? You didn't take him and look at him. What's wrong with you? They just snatched him from his mother's arms and threw him to the ground.
We agree. That's the position
And then Chief Brooks, what is the turnaround for you getting police reports from the Department of Antioch? If they do something and it's a police report involved, what is the deadline or the timeline for them to give you a police report?
Well, those are factors for us to consider. The question is whether or not the department, what we saw in reports, they can be corrupting. And I don't think that one should ever think you should rely on police reports, because they're self-serving. And it's designed really to shame the victim, and make the victim appear to be the criminal as opposed to the police being the criminal. So I mean, one should not get caught up on the police reports themselves, because when something like this happens and you know they've done something wrong, the reports themselves are written in a way to cover from what they've done wrong. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
The federal civil rights lawsuit filed by Angelo Quinto's family against the City of Antioch, the Chief of Police, and the 4 APD officers for the wrongful death of Angelo Quinto. In breaking the silence, we continue to struggle for justice alongside the Quinto family to expose and oppose the Antioch Police Department and the Chief of Police for what we believe is their cover-up of Angelo's medical condition before, during, and after his death. We condemn APD and the Chief of Police for attempting to absolve themselves of the killing of Angelo Quinto. During their press conference, the Chief of Police claimed the cause of death wasn't caused by asphyxia, but by an unrelated medical condition. He even suggested that Angelo was under the influence at the time of his death. All these claims have been debunked by an independent autopsy and medical examination. However, now we remain vigilant of the tactics that APD may utilize to continue to demonize Angelo and to intimidate his family. We expect that they will do whatever it takes to shield themselves from the community's call for accountability and justice. However, the coalition remains steadfast in demanding that the killer cops responsible for Angelo's death are taken off the streets and prosecuted. We will continue to organize and uphold Angelo Quinto's name, forge solidarity with other families of victims taken by police killings, and build alternative pro-people responses and community-based programs that address the needs of our communities who are driven to mental health crises inherently tied to a callous system that would rather see perpetrators of state violence roam the streets than address the roots of our community's problems. To that we say, justice for Angelo Quinto, justice for all.
Justice for Angelo Quinto and family. Justice for Angelo Quinto and family.
All right, good. Thank all of you.